Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Looks like it's about to get some bad weather here as I record this on Wednesday afternoon. Um, as you know, you've got discussion questions for Freud. I will be, as usual, sending you responses to those questions, drawing from your own responses. I'll put together some things and make sure to share that with you. Some of those will deal with the latter parts of civilization as discontent, having to do with civilization in terms of the pros and cons of civilization, how civilization has impacted over time our views of sexuality and of human nature, especially when it comes in conflict with the id. Talk a little more about the superego and the difference between doing something that goes against the superego versus just thinking about doing something, and sort of those kinds of issues related to guilt. As you think about those issues, think about Nikolai the Painter in Crime and Punishment, right? Who turns himself in and claims that he was a murderer, and when he wasn't, ends up committing suicide. And we know he carries a lot of guilt, internalized guilt. And I think it would be interesting to think about Nikolai the Painter in terms of Freud. I think it's also interesting to think about Raskolnikov and the different aspects of his psyche and his behavior in terms of Freud. So think about that a little bit as you finish up the Freud reading and prepare responses to those discussion questions. What I'm going to be spending my time on for this particular lecture is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. As always, I'll give some introductory comments about who she was, and then talk specifically about the story. It's a very intense story. For those of you who have already read it, it's relatively short, but there's an awful lot that's packed into that short amount of time. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the different sort of interpretations also of that story. So first of all, here is a picture of Charlotte Perkins Gilman with a quotation that I think certainly fits in with this particular story among the many things that she wrote. In our steady insistence on proclaiming sex distinction, we have grown to consider most human attributes as masculine attributes, for the simple reason that they were allowed for men and forbidden for women. So I think we've seen this semester, and it's certainly something we discuss a lot in Hum 1, which goes obviously back further in time. The way in which what it means to be a human being and human nature have been defined by male attributes, right? Things that are identified with maleness, things that are identified with and reflected in males' roles in society, especially in what's called the public sphere, right, of jobs and politics and those kind of things that women have been limited in historically, and in some cultures in some nations that's still the case. And but the what's considered normal for human beings, human nature, human behavior, is been defined by those kind of masculine attributes. So what's often thought of as abnormal has often been identified with women. When we think about behavior, when we think about interests, when we think about talents that people have, and therefore, again, what's appropriate for people in life, I think that's something that's sort of important to keep in mind here. So there is that quotation with a picture. Here's another, two other slides that get into her biography a little bit. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1860. Her father was Frederick Beecher Perkins, who was part of the famous New England Beecher family, which included novelist Elizabeth Beecher Stowe. Her father was a magazine editor, frequently left the family for long periods of time for his work. So she did find quite a bit of time with Catherine Beecher, who was an advocate of what's called domestic feminism. So feminism in terms of preparing women better for being better in the domestic sphere. So not really challenging that domestic sphere, but saying that if women are going to be better housewives, better mothers, et cetera, that more education is something that is necessary. Isabella Beecher Hooker, who was actually an ardent suffragette, one of her other relatives. And then again, as it's mentioned here, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Gilman's father deserted her family shortly after her birth. Her mother struggled to support herself and her two kids and withheld from them a lot of physical expressions of love. So her growing up was kind of lonely and painful, as it's kind of described here. And then in her own life, she experienced difficulties with family, with her health, etc., that I think are reflected in the yellow wallpaper. Here's some more sort of information on Perkins Gilman. So I mentioned born 1860. So we're thinking, really early Civil War era. It died in 1935 between World War I and World War II. So around the time that Freud was writing Civilization is Discontents, that would have been the latter part of her life. Yellow Wallpaper was written in the early 1890s. I've seen a couple different dates for it. Typically thought of as the Victorian era, right? When Victorian morals and ethics were predominant, Victorian views of a woman's place in society. Freud kind of, I think, talks about that era when he talks about civilization as being very repressive for all, for men and women when it comes to sexuality, very specific, sort of rigorous views of ethics and ethical behavior that were very, confining, especially for women at the time, and very specific gender roles for women, especially middle class, upper middle class women, when we think of the Victorian era. She did suffer from postpartum depression after giving the birth of her daughter. So when she's writing the Yellow Wallpaper, it was to a significant extent, at least in terms of her experiences with her depression, something that is certainly autobiographical. Famous quotation, there is no female brain. The brain is not an organ of sex. Might as well speak of a female liver. So in other words, women have the same intellectual capacities, the same brains as men do, and therefore should have the same kinds of opportunities. When in 1884, she did marry Charles Stetson. She was 24 at the time. And soon after the birth of the first child, suffered a nervous breakdown, again, postpartum depression. She ended up getting a divorce and moving to California. And her daughter remained with her ex-husband. And she really turned to writing as a way of trying to earn money when she moved to California. Along with Yellow Wallpaper, she did write other stories, poetry, fiction, another book that I'll talk about in a minute that's very interesting. Her best known work from that period was called Women in Economics. 1898, she argued that sexual and material roles of women have been overemphasized to the detriment of their social and economic potential, and that only economic independence could bring true freedom, right? You can say women would be free to leave, relationships that are abusive, but of course, if you had nowhere to go, you were really not free in a meaningful sense because you did not have education, the ability to take up any kind of a job other than being a domestic. So you really did not have meaningful independence and meaningful freedom. Gilman did give a number of lectures on women's topics, including work and family. She believed women and men should take joint responsibility when it comes to housework. She remarried in 1900. George Houghton Gilman, who was her first cousin. It was not uncommon at the time to marry first cousins. She continued to write during that period. She wrote a book called Human Work in 1904, a book called The Man-Made World in 1911, where she asserted that women should work outside the home, fully using their abilities for the benefit of society and for their own satisfaction. From 1909 to 1916, she founded and edited a journal called Forerunner, which obviously included progressive topics, especially in relation to women's opportunities, women's education. She also co-founded the Women's Peace Party in 1915, which actually was pretty influential at the time. And in particular, in advocating for the U.S. to stay out of World War I. And one of her, the other co-founders of this Peace Party was Jane Addams, who I may have mentioned before, was with a colleague, founder of Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago for recent immigrants into Chicago. A lot of the immigrants came from Northern Europe and to an extent Eastern Europe as well. Worked in the meatpacking industry and the stockyards in Chicago. And Jane Addams developed Hull House as a place for women and men to come, and she provided services for those people, education, lectures for the children, a place where they could come together and meet and talk about challenges and issues that they were facing, again, as recent immigrants in Chicago. It included a theater and other kinds of outlets for creativity. She did quite a bit of work going around Chicago and collecting data on what she saw in terms of the living situation for a lot of these immigrants who didn't really have healthy living conditions. And she sort of promoted healthy living conditions, both in workshops and education for these immigrants, and also in going to the city and trying to make sure that she did what she could to get them clean water, better sanitation, those kinds of things. And so that was part of her work, Jane Addams' work, and I'm sure those were also interests that Charlotte Perkins Gilman had as well. Died again in 1935, as you can see from the slide. She was 75 at the time. She realized that she had cancer, and it was inoperable cancer that was going to be causing her increasing pain. And so she ended up, first of all, writing about her situation. There was a final note that she wrote, when one is assured of unavoidable and imminent death, it is the simplest of human rights to choose a quick and easy death in place of a slow and horrible one. So she ended up taking her own life and really arguing for that right, for all people, especially people who are really suffering as she was suffering from extreme illness. I mentioned that she wrote a number of things in addition to Yellow Wallpaper, including other things that were fictional. One of her other stories is very interesting that if you enjoyed Yellow Wallpaper, you might really find this interesting. It was called Her Land. The subtitle here, this particular edition, says a lost feminist utopian novel. Then mentions that she was the author of the Yellow Wallpaper. It's a very interesting story. It's about three men who are out on some excursions and end up finding themselves in this society that nobody seemingly has ever heard of before. And it's called Her Land, at least in the story. That's the way Charlotte Perkins Gilman refers to it. And she introduces these three men, sort of what their personalities like, what their interests are like. And Her Land is run by women. And so it's very interesting to see how these three men, especially given their different personalities, how masculine they are in terms of what we identify as traditional masculine traits. And again, what their interests and talents are, and how they fare in the society that's run by women. It's a very different experience for the three of them because they are very different, again, in their personalities and their interests, etc. So it's interesting seeing how they, sort of get along in this sort of feminist utopian society called Hairland. So again, if you found Yellow Wallpaper interesting, if you're interested in a lot of the sort of women's issues that are discussed in Yellow Wallpaper and some of the other things we've been talking about, going back to Mary Wollstonecraft, I would recommend Her Land. It's a short novel, very entertaining, but also I think very insightful on a lot of these issues. So let's turn then to the Yellow Wallpaper. It's interesting, if you do a Google image search for the yellow wallpaper, you'll find all different portrayals of what this yellow wallpaper might have looked like as it's sort of described. Some more disturbing than others. I know that we've talked a lot about, and I've mentioned a lot, the color yellow as referring to sort of illness, sickness, as well as evil. We saw it throughout Frankenstein. The color of the skin of Frankenstein's creation, the moon turning yellow. We saw lots of references to yellow in Crime and Punishment, again, in people's skin color, paper, wallpaper, lots of things that, again, represented depression and illness. And so here we have the yellow wallpaper. So lots of different ideas about what this yellow wallpaper might look like. I just sort of grabbed one of them here. And you can see that it has bars in front of it and sort of a hand, maybe reaching out. So this is one person's vision of what this yellow wallpaper sort of might have looked like. So the setting of the story is obviously very important. It's at an old sort of isolated estate. Sounds like it may be on an island. It's certainly near the bay as it's described. It seems like a very Victorian era sort of building, an estate for what potentially was a wealthy family. Her husband and she rent this estate for, I think it's 3 months, because she's been suffering from an illness. And the belief at the time among many people, certainly among males who were made up a large proportion of physicians at the time, was what was called the rest cure, where you would just kind of escape from society and essentially just rest, and in particular not use your intelligence, not use your brain at all, and live a very passive sort of existence. And because she's been suffering, the narrator of the story, they go to stay at this Victorian mansion. Supposedly, they're kind of sketchy a little bit in terms of what happened to this estate, why it's not occupied at the time. Supposedly squabbles between different people who had claims to inheriting it. Perhaps that something really bad may have happened there at one time. So we get a real Gothic, I think, overall feeling for this estate. And in fact, I think this story sort of overall sort of reminds me of English Gothic novels. In particular, the short stories of Henry James always come to mind when I read this story. So it does have that sort of feel to it. So the circumstances are sort of interesting here of this house. It is isolated. So she is both isolated and being away from her home, and also being isolated and being stuck within this house for most of the time. She does walk the grounds. It's described as having these large gardens, which are very much like the old English gardens, surrounded by boxwoods and different paths through the garden. And that's the only place that she can really spend time outside of her room in this estate. There's a lot of description of her husband, who is sort of doing his best to take care of her, but he obviously is defined here as being somebody who is obviously very much limiting her opportunities, again, to socialize, to do any kind of activities, and using her brain at all. She describes him, positively in a lot of ways, because he's trying to do his best for her. There's a part of her that certainly believes that what he's doing is he's trying to do the right thing to help her. She's getting worse, but she doesn't necessarily blame that on him. She describes him as practical and rational. He treats her very much like a baby, talks to her like she's a baby, coddles her. She doesn't have any freedom. So at the same time that he can say that that, he is treating her well. He's doing what's best for her, that she has everything taken care of for her. We know that she has a baby. She doesn't spend any time with her baby. There's a nurse, Mary, that takes care of the baby. And so on the surface, he's trying to help her deal with stress by taking the stress out of her life and having her baby taken care of and going off to this estate where she doesn't have to entertain people and socialize. He doesn't want her to do any reading or any writing, certainly nothing that is going to tax her brain and her imagination. We do know, because she describes, and in this writing she does on the sly, this kind of diary that she keeps, that she has a very powerful imagination. She's very creative, and she needs an outlet for it. Right. So not being able to write or read is for her, very disturbing, very upsetting, and as we see over time, is making her condition worse and not better. And in particular, because she does seem to be somebody who does need an outlet for her imagination. And we find that outlet ends up becoming this yellow wallpaper that's in this room that she's staying in. So as well as describing this, the kind of Victorian estate in a way that is sort of eerie and Gothic, she also provides a description of the room that she's staying in. The room that she's staying in is at the very top of the building. It has windows on all four sides. She mentions that you can see the bay from these windows. A lot of houses built during the Victorian era have these almost like a cupola on top of them where they have windows on all four sides. Places that are built on, where you have a really nice view, you will see these. In fact, if you look on Main Street in Geneseo, at least one or two of the houses have these sort of cupolas at the top where there are, windows on all four sides, so you can overlook the valley. She describes here, in this particular case, that you can see the bay from these windows, right? And sometimes these places, when they were right near the water, would have what was called a widow's walk, where the women would watch for the ships to come in, hoping to see the ship that their husband or son or whatever may have been on. Many people that we know during this era died at sea because of, through storms. In the Northeast, a lot of these were whaling ships, and whaling was extremely dangerous. If you read Moby Dick, you'll see that, and other stories that have to deal with whaling. So you can sort of imagine that what this room may have been like, and having this view out of one side of these gardens and on the other side potentially of the bay. At least that's sort of how I imagine it. I should say there are quite a few kind of student films, as well as at least one I know of a regular film that was done of the yellow wallpaper. I haven't seen them. I'm still at the point where I like to kind of use my imagination about what everything may have looked like. But if you're interested, you can maybe find some of this on YouTube. Again, it has the windows on all four sides. She says that it appears like it may have been a nursery at one point. There is a gate. It sounds like the gate was either at the bottom or the top of the stairs. If it was a nursery, it may have been the gate at the top of the stairs, so that the young child, toddler, wouldn't have tumbled down the stairs. So these gates were often put in place. She also says that it looks like it may have been a gym. There are metal rings in the walls. Then the bed is nailed to the floor. The wallpaper is really torn off in certain areas around the top of the wall, especially around the bed and around the floor. Some of this occurred before she moved into this room. It obviously gets worse because she starts also tearing that wallpaper off. But you get this really disturbing scene of what this room was like, with this sickly looking wallpaper that she says doesn't seem to have a rational pattern to it. And she says when they first moved there, she asked to have the wallpaper replaced because it's so disturbing. and her husband says he will replace it, but the longer they're there, she keeps asking to have it replaced, and it doesn't happen. And then they get to the point where he says, look, we're only going to be here another month or another couple of weeks. It's not worth replacing it now. So she has to live with it for, I believe it's 3 months. But this room sort of looks like, the way it's described, almost like a prison or a torture chamber of some kind. Again, it does seem very Gothic here. Perhaps it was a nursery. On the other hand, the metal rings in the walls are sort of odd. Why would you use a room like this as a gymnasium? It almost seemed like somebody potentially who had had some kind of a mental breakdown, was mentally disturbed, may have been confined in that room. So she might not have been the first person in that room who had, was under extreme mental duress and was experiencing emotional and psychological difficulties. So very disturbing environment that she describes. You'll see in this picture, in this portrayal of what this wallpaper might look like, that there are bars across it. She also describes that this room had, on all the windows on all four sides, bars in the windows. And, bars could have been in a room that's a nursery or for young children. You probably would need to maybe open the windows to let fresh air in. The rooms at the top of the building would have been the hottest rooms, especially if this was a nursery. So you needed to be able to open the windows, but you wouldn't want anybody to topple out of those windows. She obviously experiences this increasingly like a prison for having these bars in front of the windows. And you'll notice that she says, especially at night when the moon comes through the windows, so when there's a full moon, or any kind of a light in the sky in the evening, that these bars are projected from the windows onto the wall. So it makes this wallpaper look like it has bars across it, right? And we see increasingly during the daytime, she thinks she sees a woman in the wallpaper as she meditates on it, stares at it, and then at night it looks like it has these bars on it. And so you have to imagine what this room would have looked like with these bars projected on the wallpaper. At first, she writes about the wallpaper as something that's disturbing, that she wants removed and changed. But we find out that she ends up using it as an outlet for her imagination and becomes really fixated on it. She, again, is writing kind of on the fly because she needs to write. She needs an outlet. She needs to express herself. She needs to talk about what she's experiencing. But she has to do it secretly so that nobody else knows about it. Her husband doesn't want her writing. Her husband's sister, Jenny, also lives in the house and sort of takes care of her, goes on walks with her. And so the narrator doesn't want Jenny seeing her writing either. So she has to do this whenever she gets a chance, when she's alone in the room, to do this writing. You see her being gradually more obsessed with the wallpaper because her diary entries end up starting with just talking about the wallpaper itself. There are other things that she talks about. People coming to visit, the 4th of July, her wishing she could have more visitors and other things. But it increasingly becomes just about the wallpaper. And we see this increasing obsession that she has with the wallpaper. So she sees, first of all, she seems to see eyes in it, and then she sees a face over time. And at one point she says that she also sees multiple faces, and then she believes it's a woman behind the wallpaper, right? That woman obviously represents herself and her own feelings of confinement in this room. And not just confinement in this room, but confinement more broadly, right? This is social commentary. Women feeling confined and not being able to be educated and not having any kind of creative outlets or intellectual outlets, and not being able to, or being very difficult to acquire any kind of formal education outside the home, not to be able to attend college or do other kind of things to develop intellectually, to be limited to being a housewife or a domestic. So this is the larger social commentary here. So at the one point where she mentions thinking that there are multiple women behind the wallpaper, I think that's when we're supposed to see that this is generalized, not just to her or not just to this woman behind the wallpaper, but to all women living at the time. And especially probably women who are living sort of a middle-class existence who, and again, we saw this in Wollstonecraft, would have had time potentially for more education and for more opportunities to do things outside the home, because they did have enough money to have their children taken care of, somebody to do the laundry, these other kinds of things that women would have done, who didn't have the money to have, you know, a maid or a nurse for their child, whatever the situation might have been. We know that she's not allowed to take care of her child, that is supposedly going to be too stressful for her. By the same token, we can imagine that that's very disturbing for her to not be able to spend time with her child and just to have this nurse Mary take care of her. She doesn't talk about any specific experiences she has with the baby during the 3 months that they're in this house. One imagines that she's allowed to see the baby every once in a while, but not to really take care of it. And that this is, you know, disturbing for her. Most people interpret her illness as postpartum depression, which was common at the time. And we know that Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself suffered from postpartum depression. And again, this was really, this was common. It still occurs today, though we try to deal with it in hopefully better ways than just, you know, confining women and separating them from their children overall. And that it does have sort of physiological element to it, right? When you are attached to this child for 9 months, it is a part of you, and et cetera. And then after that child is born, and that sense of separation, Freud certainly talks about that, right? And actually says that sense of separation that children increasingly experience as they're separated from their mother, and then as they're separate, they see themselves as separated from their environment, et cetera, and what that sort of does psychologically. What we end up seeing sort of over time here, as she obsesses more on this wallpaper, is that she comes to see herself as this woman in the wallpaper, right, who's trying to escape. And she wants to help this person escape because, again, she's identifies with this person. So she's tearing off the wallpaper, places here and there. It's mentioned that Jenny sees it in her clothes, and it's sort of done gradually, so that maybe at least at first Jenny and her husband don't recognize that she's pulling this wallpaper off. Eventually, in the last few days, it seems like Jenny really is noticing this, and I guess is just hoping that they will, you know, it's only 3 more days or 2 more days or whatever this house, and they'll just have to deal with it. She knows she's getting worse. Her husband keeps thinking that she's getting better. She mentions to him at one point that she feels like she's losing her mind. And again, he treats her like a child and even maybe gets angry at her and says, "Don't think that way. You're getting better." And she knows she's not. Her appetite is poor, etc. So Jenny does seem to notice that she's increasingly obsessed with this wallpaper. Again, sees it in her clothes and under her fingernails. And there's a smell from the wallpaper, maybe as the wallpaper glue. And the wallpaper itself is sort of deteriorating. So you can imagine not just the visual element of this, but the smell, the heat of being in this room that's at the top of this building. So again, imagining yourself in this kind of environment. Now, totally unlike the environment that Raskolnikov found himself in his garret apartment, which was his own sort of prison here. At the very end, we see that she has become one with the narrator. And it's the last day, and she wants to let this woman free behind the wallpaper, meaning that she wants to let herself free. And she locks the room. She throws the key out the window, so she's just by herself, and she's frantically trying to tear off the rest of the wallpaper. Her husband comes home, tries to get in the room. It's locked, and he says he's going to get an axe and break the door down. She says that the key is outside the front door, and he's really disturbed and keeps trying to get in. And finally, he goes down and gets the key. opens the door, comes in the room, and sees her in this very disturbed sort of state with all this wallpaper that's been torn off, probably looking very frantic and clearly not herself. And he faints right in the doorway. And the last thing that she says is that she has to crawl over him, every time she kind of goes around the room. It could be interpreted that she has to crawl over him when she leaves the room. However, I think the way it's described, it seems to me at least maybe that she is still confined to the room and she's still making circles around the room. So here's the very end of the story. So her husband says, "What is the matter?" He cried. "For God's sake, what are you doing?" I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane. And I pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." Right. And that's where we see that she has become one with the woman in the wallpaper. Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. So I view that as he fell over and he passed out in the doorway. So she continues to circle the room and has to crawl over him every time she goes by the door, as opposed to leaving the room and coming back in. At least that's the way I interpret it. If you think about fainting, we think about fainting as identified with women, again, who are having these psychological and physical maladies. So it's sort of the tables turned here, that he's the one that fainted, whereas the women are usually the ones that faint when they're dealing with these kinds of depression and other mysterious illnesses that Mary Wollstonecraft talks about. So one of the questions is what is the situation at the end of the story? She says, "I've gotten out to spite you and Jane." That's the first time the name Jane has been mentioned. We know the baby is a boy, so the baby can't be Jane. Jenny is her husband's sister who takes care of her, and Mary takes care of the baby. So who in the world is Jane? Some people claim that she meant to write Jenny and she put Jane down by mistake. Of course, over time, this was published in different forums and revised, and one would think that somebody who was as careful a writer as she was would not have made a mistake in putting down, Jane instead of Jenny, or that it would be corrected over time. Another theory is that Jane is the part of herself that agreed to, in some sense, her confinement, and this idea that her husband really was taking good care of her and that he knew what was best for her, and it was sort of passively acquiesced to the kind of treatment that she was facing. And again, a situation that many women at the time faced. Not only was this her husband, but her husband was a physician. So she was in a doubly bad situation, not being able to challenge her husband as the one who supposedly was supposed to make the decisions in the family and knows what's best, as the rational, part of the couple, where she is the female, is the irrational part. And on top of that, he is a physician. And of course, the vast majority of physicians at the time were men. So again, she's sort of doubly in a bad situation here. There's specific mention of this physician, Weir Mitchell, who's the one who developed and was famous for this rest cure. We know that Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself was a patient at a time of Weir Mitchell. And in fact, she claims that she wrote the story about her experience and even to make up making a public criticism of Weir Mitchell in this rest cure. There are different anecdotes, stories, some probably apocryphal, about what happened after this was published, whether Weir Mitchell kept doing the rest cure, whether he decided not to do it at that point and realized that it was causing more harm than good. So you can sort of read about that for yourself, but it is sort of interesting to think about. So this Jane person, again, many people argue, and I think most people argue probably, is again this part of herself that she has split from and she has escaped from her confinement and tearing off this yellow wallpaper, her husband having passed out. But she still seems confined to the room, at least as I interpret it. And yes, she has escaped. So you can see that maybe it's a victory for her and that she has escaped and freed the woman from behind the wallpaper, and that woman being a part of her, maybe that she identifies with this Jane person. Her husband has passed out. Nonetheless, seems to be completely separated from reality, right? So she's escaped, but maybe into her own little psychological world. It is a world maybe that their husband does not have access to, which we might view as a victory in some sense, but clearly she's in very bad shape at the end, and has had this complete break from reality, even though she's freed herself in some sense, from the wallpaper, from the Jane part of her persona. She's taken some kind of form of action that's the only really kind of action that she can take, because she couldn't tell her husband, what you're doing is making me worse. We have to do something different. This is bad, because supposedly he knew what was best for her. It was her husband. He was a physician. But that, we can sort of imagine maybe that he at least has the realization at the end when he comes to after fainting that that she is worse rather than better, and that what he's done perhaps has made her worse. So if we imagine her husband in the position of this Weir Mitchell, this physician, that maybe at least it's time to rethink this rest cure and the fact that she is worse rather than better. At some level, it seems like he did know this and Jenny knew this. It seems like they must have known that she was getting worse and not eating and becoming, more and more, again, psychotic, detached from reality. And that they were hoping that if they can just make it through the last part of the stay, this Victorian house, that they'll leave. We know he's working in a physician in town, as he describes it here. We don't know if it's where he usually works or if he was just working in another place for the 3 months they were staying in this home. And she does suggest a couple times that she wants to go elsewhere, or at least stay in a different room in the house, or change the wallpaper. But again, none of this happens until she has this complete break from reality. So that's the story of the yellow wallpaper. Is the narrator's sort of insanity, is her break from reality permanent or not? How is it going to impact Jenny and her husband? What happens after the end of the story? What happens when he comes to at the end? Does her life change? How does it change? Does she manage to retrieve her sanity at some point? If so, what happens? So we're left with all these questions, at the end of the story, about what her life is like, after having experienced these 3 months in this Victorian house, confined most of the day to this disturbing sort of room that seems like it may have had some disturbing things happen in it previously. So I hope you've enjoyed the story. Not so much enjoyed it, and it's not a happy story, but it's very engaging, I think, very well written. Lots of, obviously symbolism and things that it leaves us to think about. So I hope you found that meaningful. We'll be moving on here briefly to our last reading, which is Elie Wiesel's trilogy. Again, the original text was Night, which was about his experience in the Holocaust, and a lot of that experience with his father. And then we're also going to read Dawn and Day, which are 2 other more fictional books that he wrote, or stories that he wrote, about characters that were Holocaust survivors. And I think reading Dawn and Day after reading Night, it adds some meaning to it, some significance to it when we think about how did Elie Wiesel go on with his life after having survived the Holocaust. So that will be our next reading. So I'll see you for our next lecture.